Okay. So welcome to the Hope Medical Scholars Personal Statement webinar. I know this says work and activities and secondaries as well, but that'll actually be a different webinar that we'll do later on in June, or in March, sorry, not June. So tonight we're just going to focus on the personal statement. All right, and for all of you who may not know what Hope Medical Scholars is, it is an intensive immersion program and mentorship program targeted toward underrepresented minority and first generation students. We hope to provide mentorship and provide students the opportunity to get a snapshot of a day in the life of med school students, and see what a life like in medicine could look like for them as well. Our in-person immersion day is actually going to be April 26th this year. So maybe at the end of this webinar, I'll put the interest form for that in the chat if any of you are interested in learning more about that experience. For that, you would come onto campus, come to classes with us. There's going to be a suturing workshop, like a faculty meet and greet, a lunch as well. So it'll be like a really cool experience. So just wanted to pop that. All right, and this is our exec board. My name's Katie. I'm the president of Hope this year. This is Alejandro, our vice president. Here's a few other board members, not here tonight, but big part of the team. And then some other board members as well. All right, and we also have a guest with us tonight, so I'm going to let her introduce herself as well.
Hi, everybody. My name is Anna. I'm a fourth year student here at Harvard applying into OBGYN, and have been just like helping out with some of the Hope webinars and talks that they put on the last few years. And I think it is an awesome organization. So we're happy you're all here.
If any of you have any questions throughout this, feel free to put them in the chat, but also we'll have time at the end for like a Q&A. And we might even do breakout rooms as well, so you can ask more one-on-one questions too. Okay, Anna's going to kick us off.
All right, so personal statements 101. We're going to just start with like some basics. So what we think is important is starting early. So probably around now, like end of February, early March. And when we say to start, it really just means like getting your thoughts down, going through this brainstorming phase, like thinking about, what are your personal experiences? What is your story? And how has that brought you to medicine? We'll be talking a lot tonight about your seed story, which we think is a really important place to start. And a rough draft, like I think I went through 15 or 16 drafts of my personal statement, and the first few were like, I was confusing myself. So that's just why we say to start early. And I'm sure most of you are better writers than I was 4 or 5 years ago. So take what we say there like with a grain of salt, but just start thinking about, your seed story, your experiences now. And then we'll also be talking about, what do we think is the strongest way to write a personal statement? And we think two things that go into that are using more of a narrative and an active voice throughout. And the next some common mistakes is really not giving yourself enough time, and not asking for enough feedback. We think the earlier you start, the more people you're going to be able to send your personal statement to, and the more feedback you're going to be able to elicit. When it comes to feedback, however, we think you should be taking it, regarding your stories, your through line per se, and your writing style and like writing techniques to make sure it's very strong. But we do want to tell people to be careful to maintain their own voice, because throughout this process, it's easy to get influenced by others, but we want you all, like you've reached a point where you're thinking about applying or already are in the process of applying to med school. So you have a strong personal story, and your journey should be your own going there. So don't be over influenced by people's feedback on your story, is what we like to say. We also want to say it's really important to avoid just listing your resume. You all have done awesome things and you've done a lot of things, and it might feel like you need to tell the reader all those things in your personal statement. But the point of this statement is really to show how you've grown through experiences in your life and show what you'll bring to a med school class, not to rehash your resume and tell them all the amazing things you've done, because they'll be able to read that in your activities section.
All right. So we're going to show you a few different personal statement examples on this call. But here's just sort of like a general bare bones formatting tips and tricks from Hope. So we recommend starting in media res, which kind of means that you're just jumping into the thick of it. So you'll see in our examples that we sort of both begin with a story, and that's something that'll be emphasized a lot here tonight, is really the idea of showing your reader and not telling your reader. Um, Readers sort of inherently find reading human stories much more interesting. And if you're telling a story, it's much more likely to stick in an admissions committee member's mind than just sort of a rehashing of accomplishments. So that's why we recommend jumping in the middle of a story. It's also something that will captivate the reader's attention immediately and make them want to keep reading. Um, but equally important is you want to include a reflection to your story. How did you grow? What did you learn? What skills did you gain? Um, why are you a good fit for medicine based off of this story? And what is your value add? And that is something that Anna just referenced as well, as what are you going to add to the medical school class? Um, Admissions committees are reading thousands of these. Um, and a lot of pre-meds have sort of been presidents of clubs, have shadowed, have volunteered, have done all these wonderful things. But it's sort of that unique story that makes the admissions committee remember you. So really don't be afraid to personalize this and try not to speak in generalities. But we'll show examples of what we mean by that as well. Okay. Um, so I just wanted to point out that there is more than one way to go about writing a personal statement. I'm going to share how I approached it as will Anna, but maybe you all will approach it a little bit differently as well. But here's a few steps that I sort of endorse. So sort of in your initial brainstorming phase, think about what experience in your life initially drew you to medicine. It might be a moment from childhood, or it might be a moment much later, like in college. But this will be sort of your seed story. And try to reflect on what it was about that experience that specifically drew you to medicine. And that could be an example of a great theme for your personal statement. For example, are you drawn to medicine for the one-on-one connections, wanting to support others, the love of the science and the pathology, wanting to serve and give back to your community? And you can certainly have more than one theme, but this will be something that sort of all the stories in your personal statement relate back to. And this brings me to number two. In addition to your seed story, try to think of 2 to 3 other stories from your life that sort of interweave that unique theme and how you demonstrated it and how it relates back to medicine. And when you tell your story, always try to make sure to include what you learned from it and how it can relate to medicine. And did you grow in any way? And then you want to always have a conclusion that sort of ties it all together using the stories and bringing back your theme as sort of your ending finale. And lastly, number 4, show what you will bring to medicine in your class. You all have unique skills and talents, so it's just really important that in your personal statement, you're showing what you specifically can offer. But we'll show examples of that too. Okay, so this is an example from my personal statement. This was my seed paragraph. So as you can see, I sort of started with my first exposure to medicine, which was through my parents. And this isn't so much as a story, but this was sort of my background of how I got into medicine. But I do reference going on rounds with my dad and giving multiple sclerosis shots with my mom to our neighbor. So those are 2 very human experiences that I'm referencing. Um, and then I think sort of the important part of this question is, or this paragraph is the last 2 sentences is where I introduce my main theme that I'm going to continue to reference throughout my personal statement. So just to read the last sentence, I hope to serve and heal others as a physician by building an understanding of my patients in the context of their histories and forging deep personal connections with them to provide compassionate, individualized care. So my big thing was I was drawn to medicine for the opportunity to get to know people deeply and provide one-on-one care. So when I show sort of later examples in my personal statement, I want you to keep this theme in mind because this is something I'm going to continually reference in my other stories. Um, so these are some stories that I use to demonstrate my theme. And I also wanted to point out that your stories don't have to necessarily be medical. Um, my first story that I tell is a story that I is from working with a student who I tutored for several years. And I talk about the rewards of really working one-on-one with someone and watching them grow through adversity and you growing with them as well. My second story was clinical. I do think it is nice if you can have maybe one clinical story, but not mandatory by any means. I talk about a patient I saw while shadowing and how the physician really catered his particular care style to this patient and treated this patient like a really unique person. And then I talk about a story about working with a patient in hospice and how I spent learning her unique likes and dislikes to kind of make her final days as meaningful as possible and hope that she could get the most out of life that she had left. So, kind of the common thread of all three of these stories is how I worked one on one with someone or watched a physician work one on one with someone. Um, all right. And this is actually an example from my second paragraph. This was the tutoring story that I just referenced. Just kind of the skeleton framework of this paragraph. I have a transition sentence, which is my first sentence, sort of transitioning from story to story. You'll probably want to have that as the first sentence of every paragraph, just so you're not jumping from story to story without any connection for your reader to draw between them. The middle chunk of the paragraph is the story itself. It's a very personal story. It's talking about real characters. I know some resources online will tell you to put like quotations around names. I didn't do that. I just changed all the names of people in my personal statement. So either one. And then the last two sentences, I just make a reference back to my original theme. Through tutoring, it struck me that as a physician, I could apply this level of personalization to patient care, taking the time to appreciate my patient's goals and challenges before their symptoms will allow me to provide more comprehensive and collaborative care with the patient. Um, so just having that connection back to medicine, or else my reader might be left thinking, well, it's great that she tutored, but like, what does that have to do with why she wants to be a doctor? So it is important to kind of have that like final reflection piece after every story. And then an example conclusion paragraph. This is sort of what I mentioned earlier, is you want to tie all your stories together. So this is about tutoring, and then meeting Zach at St. Jude is the shadowing story, and then singing with Patricia and hospice is the hospice story. And then I say I've always been drawn to the profound personal nature of one-on-one care. So you want to really drive home sort of that overarching theme of why medicine, and then maybe expound upon that a little bit in your conclusion. It's really important not to just write a bunch of generic statements about why medicine is great, wrap it up, and then call it a conclusion. You really want to try to make it specific to everything that you talked about earlier in the essay. And it doesn't have to be long. As you can see, my conclusion is only 4 sentences. Okay.
Thanks, Katie. So similar to Katie, I think the way that I went through writing my personal statement was also, chronological and did really focus on like starting with a salient story from my own life, telling a few stories that went along with, my theme and my main motivation to go into medicine, which was seeing barriers to care and like assisting people in like very uncertain, vulnerable, scary times. So I'll just take you through some examples that are edited from my own personal statement from when I applied. So I started with a story about my father that like was very salient to my childhood. I talk about experiences, being in a rural area, going to an emergency room, and that feeling of being like overwhelmed, which a lot of people have in many different areas of life. But then seeing how being around a physician, using and showing this through like a more narrative lens, saying, I started to feel as if stable ground was forming beneath my feet. In that moment, I was unsure of many things, but I was certain of this doctor's support for my family. And so that for me was really my seed story. And then it goes into, what am I going to do with that? And why am I going into medicine because of something like this? And it's really to provide assistance and healing during uncertain times. So this is just one example of how you can establish a narrative through line in that first paragraph. And what I also think is important is, showing the reader who you are and getting them interested in learning more. And by using a more narrative tone, I think that's easier to do. As Katie said, as humans, we like to read stories. So presenting your reader with a story about you, I think is a powerful way to start your statement. And then we'll talk a little bit about how I structured the middle part of my personal statement, which was really showing, cool, interested in medicine, and then where did that go from there? So, as my interest in medicine grew, what I got really involved with is thinking more about barriers to quality healthcare and how, differences in people's access, depending on location, language, has impacted them and what that meant for me. So I start by talking about a time I volunteered in a hospice and just one specific story of a patient that I became very close to, and making that more focused on our relationship, me and that patient, and how I grew from that. And I think something that's super important for all of you to think about as you're writing these statements is you've done a lot of awesome things, but how has that changed who you are and how has it changed how you think about medicine and yourself? So, one example of that is I say, like, looking back, what I'm grateful for, what I learned from that experience. So, you can do that for any experience in your life. And that just shows growth and like more of a mature outlook on the things you've gone through that will make you a great med student and future doctor. And then just an example edited from my conclusion paragraph is, and as Katie has said, like finishing with something called a value add. So I think it might feel hard right now, not knowing like exactly maybe how you see yourself in med school or how you see yourself as a doctor. You don't probably all know exactly what you'll be specializing in. Some of you do, and that's awesome. But really going into your conclusion paragraph with all of the values and your personal narrative that you've pulled through your all your paragraphs until now, and ending by saying, what do you look like as a medical student? And what, unique things are you bringing to your medical class? Because the people building this are building a community, and it doesn't matter what you say there, it just matters that it's true to you. So I am really into advocacy work and specifically doing work with like underserved women who are Spanish speaking. And so for me, like, that's what I want to do, be an advocate, provide compassionate patient centered care. You could be really into education and want to go into med ed. You could be really into research and want to start doing more clinical research. Just say, anything you're interested in and make sure it's like true to who you are. And yeah, you can end on like a strong note, and people will be so excited to have you in their medical class.
All right. So these were just some final takeaway tips that we put together. First one, do not afraid to get personal. Um, as you saw in both of our personal statements, we included personal details from our lives, about the people in our lives, about challenges we'd faced, stories we'd experienced. Notice how it sort of wasn't a reiteration of accomplishments. It was more experience based. A lot of narrative language demonstrating emotion. I put here, you are not a robot. That being said, sometimes simple language can be more powerful than overly flowery language. Using too many adjectives can sometimes be distracting to the reader. Um, so yeah, just be aware of that and try not to use too many cliches too, if you can. I know those can sometimes be easy to kind of include because they add sort of this flourish. But as I said, try to stick to simple language that shows your emotion. And number two, show growth. What did you learn from each experience? Every story should have some kind of reflection. Um, how have you changed through your life and your journey to med school? It's important to use resilience focused language, focus on what you gained from the experience. When you're describing sort of a challenge, you definitely want to focus more on sort of the growth side of that challenge and what you gained from the experience. Um, the goal of the personal statement is not for the admissions committee to sort of pity you. You want them to see what you've grown, how you've grown, and become stronger from your experiences as well. And in doing that, it's also important to sort of keep an attitude of humility and focus on how the experience prepared you to be a better physician or how you're going to use it to better give back to others. So more sort of others focused than you focused, I guess. As I mentioned earlier, try to avoid generic statements and cliches. Make sure to tie your themes together in the conclusion and reference your theme throughout your story and your body paragraphs as well. Um, and try to avoid any negative language, thus viewing things through a negative language, negative tone, that kind of thing. Um, try to avoid speaking negatively about medicine and physicians. But that being said, you can sort of talk about how you want the system to be better, but try to avoid talking negatively about individual people, individual doctors, that kind of thing. But by all means, you can definitely talk about how you want to change like the system for the better, and be an advocate as on a reference. Great. Um, okay. So if anyone has any further questions, we're happy to take those now. And if you have any other questions that maybe come up in the future, feel free to reach out to our email, hopemedicalscholars@hms.harvard. Plug to follow our social media at Hope Medical Scholars. We're going to be hosting a bunch more webinars this spring, and the immersion day information is available on there as well. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to stop screen sharing. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or reach out to us directly.